This is Candid Conversations with Dr. Mayfield, a podcast that resources families and friends with tools to have important conversations about mental and emotional health. This show is sponsored by Mayfield Counseling Centers, helping you find clarity, hope, and purpose. Here's your host, Trevor Sheeran.
Thank you for joining us on Candid Conversations. We are joined today by my supervisor and a licensed therapist in Colorado, Jesse Steffes. And Jesse, your specialty is exactly what we're talking about today.
Great.
And it is grief, right?
It is grief, yes.
So let's start with a quick summary because there's a lot of misconceptions about what grief is. So
Sure.
Can you get us on the right path so we can have this conversation?
Sure. So I think something to consider when we're talking about grief is that grief and loss go hand in hand. We often think of grief as just meaning bereavement or the death of somebody. There's a lot of other losses that we can experience in life that we grieve. So loss of health, loss of relationships, loss of hope and dreams, any expectations we may have had that aren't going to be what we thought. So the first thing, I guess, is to just broaden our understanding of it's not just when someone dies.
That's awesome. I think that's a big deal because I have a lot of people come into the office, and I'm sure you've had too, that have I shouldn't be feeling this way. Nobody died.
Right.
You're like, well,
something died.
Something died.
Yeah,
it's okay.
Exactly.
Well, and it's interesting to me too because I at Mayfield we do a lot of stuff from a trauma-focused lens, and it's been interesting to me to see how, in a lot of ways, you can do most things from a trauma lens and consider most things trauma.
Correct.
And even in our conversations, you've mentioned that there are a lot of things that we normally wouldn't think of that can be considered part of the grief umbrella.
Right.
And we can treat certain circumstances through that lens.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, and I think something to consider that you're highlighting really well is that grief is an aspect of trauma because it's out of our control, usually. One of the things that really hit that home for me in my training was that we actually diagnose complicated grief as an other specified trauma related disorder because of how we experience it, interpret it, struggle to adapt to it. And that is outside of what we call normal bereavement. But outside of that, when we're looking at traumatic losses, that is a trauma.
I think you made a comment that I get a lot of people asking, normal bereavement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's I think it can be people. Well, I don't know. Is there normal bereavement? Because that's what I mean. I think we put that in the DSM just because we need something.
Because we love books to
right?
categorize people and things.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I have people come in all the time. Am I on track?
Yeah.
I read this book about the stages, and I'm like,
Yeah.
there aren't any stages. Sorry.
There is no stage. Mark, I'm so proud that you know there's no stages.
It drives me absolutely bananas when people are like, well, I read the stages of grief. I'm like, well, you're not.
Throw it away.
Throw it away. You're not the one dying.
Yeah. Yeah.
But people want the litmus test or the, hey, am I on the right track? And I'm like, we can talk through that, yes, but it's not like A plus B equals C.
Yeah, and one of the biggest things to kind of throw out the window initially is that timeline that we talk about because in my experience with grief, what I notice is that year mark where the DSM says you should be okay, everything's fine, is usually the anniversary of the death where all of the symptoms and all of the distress actually end up peaking pretty severely.
Yeah.
And so for someone who has the knowledge of in a year you should be okay to experience all of those symptoms would then think something's off. One of the things I tell all of my clients when I'm working with grief is basically everything in grief is normal because we all are going to grieve differently.
Yes.
To include even, and this is something surprising, suicidality is common in grief. And what differentiates it from depressive suicidality is we're longing to join the person we lost. So even that can become very scary for a client, but it's quite normal in the grieving process.
When I think the normalcy of what we expect ourselves to go through can be devastating to our process of growth in general and developing as a person, because most of middle school is horrible because you're being compared to all of these other middle schoolers who are on very different tracks of growth. And you expect yourself to be somewhere that may not be part of your process.
Right.
And so it makes sense that in something as heavy or as important as grief or trauma, that the same would be true.
Well, I wonder too, and maybe you can speak to this. I mean, the with the traumatic grief, going back to that conversation, I work with a lot of families that have lost children by suicide. And so I'm working with those that have been left behind, and it's a whole different ballgame, than, it could be, I guess, maybe I shouldn't say but it could be a different ballgame compared to somebody that lost grandma at 90 years old, who was just died in her sleep. And I've worked with individuals that, are upset that husband is, for the most part, after 6 months, doing just fine, where, their significant other is struggling still. Like, can you speak to that a little bit as far as grieving in relationship too? I think a lot of our listeners would probably benefit from that.
Well, I think something that you're pressing on is the idea of death in a natural course of life. So grandma, grandpa dying of, maybe a long-term illness or peacefully in their sleep is much different than death by suicide. And when we look at a child dying, that messes up the natural order of aging and dying. Parents are supposed to die before their children. That adds another layer of trauma for sure. The other thing I'm thinking about is in couples, sometimes we see that if there's a female partner, she is more likely to emote and be expressive right away and initially, kind of bubbling up and getting it not out of the way, but it's right on the forefront. Sure. We see that men's grief response are usually delayed. So it makes sense that, there's an initial kind of like, this is shocking, this is awful, but they've got to move on for whatever they have going on, daily tasks, things like that. And then much later, we see it maybe manifest in other ways. And so that's something important to consider, is allowing that process to happen, but making sure the process is actually happening.
Sure.
And it's not being avoided or stuffed down, which is, I think the case for most emotions around anything. To avoid or push down is not very beneficial.
Well, if I don't have to deal with it, then never mind. Maybe if I don't have to deal with it right now, I can function. But it's going to have to come up sometime.
Right. And the meaning-making process, which, Trevor and I have had conversations about meaning-making, that how important that can be in healing, that can't be happening really if we're not actually attending to what's going on.
Right.
Even if it is painful.
I'm going to give you credit for an idea that I know isn't yours, but you were the one that taught it to me, so you get credit.
I'll take it. I love that.
And it's a really different way of viewing grief through a metaphor. Would you mind explaining a little bit of that concept?
Well, we have a couple. Are we talking about
the dog?
Okay, good. That's the one that I love. So, do you remember Clifford, the big red dog?
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
of course you do. My girls still watch it.
So Clifford's still on. I didn't understand. Wow. Yeah. Okay. So I was just thinking about this morning. Actually, there's an episode of Clifford. I think it's called Clifford, the Big Red Dog.
I think so.
Its full title. Okay. Anyways.
Pretty sure.
It's what it's called today.
It is.
Today it
Mark
is.
knows.
It is. I got the theme song stuck in my head right now. So thanks, guys.
That could be the intro for the show. So in Clifford is this giant dog. He's like the size of a house. And there's some inconsistencies in the show because he changes size from time to time, but we're not going to, split hairs. One of the things that I talk to my clients about, though, is that grief we often think is this malintended and cruel monster, chasing after us with big scary teeth and claws. And we think that because it feels like that, it feels awful and it feels inescapable. But when we turn around and actually look at the nature of grief is a big, I would say, blue dog, a big blue dog that needs fed and needs to be pet and needs to be held and acknowledged. So there's this episode of Clifford that I show my clients sometimes, just a little clip of it, where his little girl owner is washing him out in the yard, giving him a big bath. She's in her swimsuit and on the ladder washing him, and she gives him a whole bath, and he's like, "Oh, I feel so fresh and clean," And she says, "Okay, Clifford, I have to go do my homework now, but I'll come back later." And he says, "Okay, I'll be here when you come back." And I show them that because we don't have to engage with our grief in every moment, but we have to engage with our grief to take care of it. And if we treat it really well, it will be much more likely to respond and understand when we say, "Okay, I have to go do life now. I will come back."
Right.
And if we're wanting to have that trusting attachment with, a real dog or otherwise, we come back when we say we're going to come back.
I always tell, and I think it's beautiful because it gives people a picture.
Yeah.
You know, something along that line. I tell my clients that if you can't deal with grief, you know, because it's so overwhelming, I said schedule it. You know, so
Absolutely.
schedule a time to just let it. You know, I don't know. That sounds really weird. And I said, try it just once next week. You know, and they said maybe your lunch hour, just, you know, spend some time thinking about your lost fill in the blank.
Right.
And they come back and go, huh. And it wasn't so overwhelming as I thought, and then I was able to put it back together and go back to work or attend to my family or whatever. So I think it's a beautiful metaphor.
Well, there's this fear that I think is common with grief of it's never going to end. And I think it would be important for us to speak to that because I don't know if it's completely untrue.
I was going to say, I don't know if I was thinking about my grandpa yesterday, and he's been gone for almost 12 years, and I got kind of teary-eyed and, you know, that all that he has lost missed with my, you know, his grandkids, great-grandkids and that kind of stuff. So, I don't know if it ever goes away.
No, I have a very strong opinion that it doesn't ever go away. And if we look at, as opposed to the stage model, which we know we don't like, right?
Throw it away.
Throw it away. It's for people dying. But we look at the task model of grief, which is what I work from, Warden's task, where, just to mention them briefly, accepting the reality of the loss, feeling the feelings, moving on with daily life, and then emotional relocation. And the very act of emotional relocation means that we're relocating emotional attachment and helping this lost thing or lost person move in our heart, our soul, our mind, however you want to look at that, into a place where we can easily access it. Sorry.
It's okay.
Easily access it or be able to put it away when needed. And so that in itself means that we're going to always have some sort of grief for the loss, which is really an indication of how much that meant to us. So I think we're on the same page that it doesn't.
And I like seeing it from that perspective where the longer it's present, and so for Mark, your grandfather, the fact that however many years after the loss you're still feeling it speaks to the beauty of that relationship and the power that it had and how meaningful that relationship was. And I think when we're able to see it that way, and even in a lot of the conversations I've had with you, Jesse, grief becomes this very beautiful and very honoring journey.
Well, I think in some ways I'm hearing you say too, I tell my clients all the time, what does it look like to become old friends with your emotions and your feelings, right? And how that, you know, the melancholy is not a bad thing. It's actually a beautiful thing, you know, and we think about our poets of old and our, you know, even some of our current day writers and how they can turn something that's hard into something really beautiful through kind of that melancholic prose or whatever it might be. And I think we don't do a very good job of teaching, especially here in America. I mean, if I don't want to pick on anybody, but we don't do a very good job of teaching people how to be okay with their emotions, the hard and the easy ones, you know, the ones that are a little bit darker and, you know, cause maybe a little more struggle. And I think if we can do that, I think we free up a lot of maladaptive experiencing and pain. And
well, and I'm thinking too, as you're talking about that, Mark, the idea of how we actually learn to grieve. So how we, not only how we learn to experience negative feelings, but whenever I'm working with someone grieving, the first thing I ask is, how did you learn to grieve? What's the first grief you observed? And if you watched Dad be emotive around the loss of his own dad, then you stored somewhere for yourself, when I lose something, it's okay for me to feel about it.
Right.
So I work often with parents who are worried that they're grieving too much in front of their kids, or their kids are seeing them fall apart. And, you know, I want to challenge that idea, because when we allow children to watch us emote in a healthy way and feel that broad spectrum of all of the emotions, then we're actually equipping them to do that effectively as adults themselves. Or as kids, I guess, too.
Yeah, it's not foreign. But I think it goes back to, I don't do a whole lot of grief work, but when I work with parents, I talk about, you know, how do you show your kids how to fail? How do you show your kids, you know, all these examples that, you know, do those great imprinting into our kids, you know, and we often forget about grief. And that's why I love studying cultures. And, you know, and Trevor and I have talked about this quite a bit, and we use this in our talks, but the Jewish culture of sitting Shiva is such a beautiful representation of what grieving should look like.
Absolutely.
You know, not trying to fix the person, not trying to make it go away, but, you know, spending a week or so just engaging in it, the laughter and the crying and the anger and the, everything else that goes with it.
Yeah. Well, in our Western culture, I think we talk about this in our grief group is, how do we grieve and mourn? And we do it almost the least ceremoniously of any culture we know of. And, I read recently in like National Geographic, there's a culture who they allow the body to stay in the home for about a week and they adjust to relating to, if the loss is a person, they adjust to relating to them in this new form, which I think for us as Westerners, we're like, whoa, I don't know about that. Yeah, that's too much realness. But that's,
well, you're right. We kind of grieve in a very isolated manner where, because I can even remember when I lost my great-grandmother, right after losing my great-grandfather, so it was compounded, but there were times that we would gather together and laugh and tell stories and have fun together, but then the crying portions were all separate, even when we went to the funeral home to look at the casket and see my great-grandmother's body. It was turn-based. Like, we didn't go up together. Right? We went up individually, did our crying and our talking, and then walked away and let somebody else have a turn. And in all of our conversations about mental health and life in general, we've talked about how dangerous isolation can be and how we need relationship. And it's curious that in the grief process, we don't really say much about the isolation.
Well, I wonder, though, if that is just a magnifying glass in how our culture is, how our Western culture is. We've become so desirous of being an individualized, isolated culture that this really, when it hits the road, we're showing those things.
I was actually talking with a colleague recently about that exact premise of we've become so individualized and so do what's best for you. You make your own path, that the entire aspect of community and taking care of each other and kind of coming around has really dissipated even from, just a few decades ago when we really rallied around somebody in our community. Sure. And that isolation, I think we almost like make it private. And part of that, I think, is when we're grieving, and grieving hard, we feel burdensome to those around us.
Sure.
Because we're impaired, quite literally, and, we can't do what we need to do. But there's a saying I love that someone told me while I was grieving a significant loss, and it's grief shared is grief halved. So if you share it, it feels half as heavy.
Yeah.
And the other person, you don't have to worry about burdening them with that because it's not their grief, so it doesn't sit as heavy in them.
Yeah.
No, yeah. And I think we don't think that, or we don't talk about it at least.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful concept. And I think it's something that our culture, if we look at it more deeply, desires, right? But we don't know how to do it, I don't think, well.
Yeah.
We always talk about the fact that we're the most connected generation of, history, and yet the most unrelational, with
disconnected.
Social media and all that kind of stuff. And I think social media is a great thing, or can be a great thing, but it's doing these things, right? Where it's,
and I think we're the most connected executively and administratively, and the most disconnected intimacy-wise.
Oh yeah.
And I think for a lot of individuals in an individualistic culture, we miss the not nuanced difference between the two.
Well, we're oblivious to it, in that sense. Well, let me ask you this, Jesse. I think, this has been, we could probably do a 2, 3, 4, 5-part series talking about this just because we don't really ever talk about this. But somebody that obviously our stance is that you can't do this alone. Call us, call somebody in your neighborhood, your city to walk with you. But what would you tell our listeners as far as maybe resources they can seek out on their own that are good? Because Trevor and I have talked about this. I'm sure you guys have talked about it as well, that there are a lot of bad resources out there. That's the reason we thought there are stages of grief and those kinds of things. But what would you tell our listeners that would be maybe a pretty robust resource, whether it be a website or a book or
your private practice? Please plug that.
Yes, do plug that too.
Well, since you asked, I guess the first thing I would say is that there is grief that kind of runs in that least traumatic spectrum. So not every single person will require therapeutic intervention for a loss. And that's okay. If you find yourself not really being super emotionally activated by the loss of your great-great-great-grandfather, that's okay. Just notice that and move through and pay attention to it. But if there's some impairment or you're feeling like, I'm not myself, things like that, there's a lot of different layers you can access. So sometimes people are more open to accessing someone in their church community. Chaplains, we call those like lay people, and they can still be really, really skilled in helping walk someone through grief. When it becomes complicated or there's traumatic nature, so some of those, what we call disenfranchised losses of, death by suicide or drunk driver dies, things like that usually is not something that a lay person's going to be able to walk you through super easily. What I always recommend is screening, interviewing who you want to go see. So finding some resources. My private practice is called Courage Dear Heart Grief Counseling. And I have a blog there where you can contact me. And if I'm unable to see people, I'm always ready to offer referrals.
Trevor, can we put that in the tagline, please? Yeah, that'd be great.
The link will be in the description below.
Thank you.
Good.
You're welcome.
There's a great picture of me and my dog on the website.
Oh, nice.
I'm surprised we've gotten through almost an entire podcast
without talking about Jeffrey. Jeffrey's my
that's really
treasure.
impressive.
Nice.
Yeah. Thank you, Trevor. Someone noticed. But outside of that, in those interview questions, when you're first reaching out to someone, just the simple question, how do you work with grief? And if they say, I'm going to help you get your feelings out of the way and get through this quick, and that's not your person.
Run. Okay.
Hang up, run, call me and tell me so I don't refer to them. But there's also some really cool communities here in Colorado Springs for support. So there's grief share groups.
Yes.
There's groups that are specific for what we call survivors of suicide. So someone who's lost someone.
Yeah, Pikes Peak Suicide Prevention does a great job.
And they actually see a lot, just on a side note, they will see all kinds of clients there.
Nice.
So, and very, very reduced or low cost.
And grief shares all over the country.
Yes.
So.
Grief share is great. A little searching doesn't, hurt. And one of the things that I've noticed is, talking about community, you don't necessarily have to have somebody that specializes in grief, but it does feel different, especially if you are experiencing a traumatic loss. What we're able to do as certified grief practitioners or certified grief counselors is help you sift through what of this is going to pass with time and what of this we really need to kind of untangle those knots to be able to move through.
Absolutely.
Did that answer your question?
No, it did. I think that's a great way of looking at it. And does your blog have some of those questions? If somebody says, "What question should I ask?" Do you have resources on your website that
I
do?
The other thing I have on there are different blog posts that explain the tasks of grief. Okay. So I wanted to have that available so that if you are wondering where you're at, that's whenever I get a referral call for someone in private practice, I refer them there first. Because it's amazing how a little bit of education around that can really soothe some things.
Yeah. One thing we'll do, I'm telling Trevor we're going to do this, but is that we'll create a link to your website on our website so that those that are searching for that can easily find it on our website under resources.
Yep. So if you go to the Candid Conversation page at mayfieldcounseling.com, we'll have the link to Jesse's private practice, and it will also be in the link below on this podcast, whether you're listening on iTunes or watching on YouTube. Jesse, there's also several books that you've recommended in the time that I've known you that I think would be important to mention.
Yeah. So anything really by Worden, Worden, is going to walk through those tasks really well. The Grief Recovery Method is another book that's great if you want to try to work through some things on your own. Nice. That's a good one to walk through, very practical steps. I'm trying to think, just kind of narrative based. There's this really weird book called Grief is the Thing with Feathers. And for poets and whatnot out there, that's great. I actually, coming from a narrative therapy lens, I recommend poetry books quite a bit. It seems to kind of give words sometimes. So Salt by Nayira Waheed is a great one. Anything by Rupi Kaur. Yeah.
Nice.
So,
Awesome.
and I can put a link too on there for some text specific, like a what is that called? List of books.
A book list.
Book list.
A bibliography.
Summer reading list.
Summer reading list. Yeah. Well, I think that'd be good. I think, especially I know our listeners are all over the country, but I know especially for Colorado Springs, we're a grief/trauma ridden county right now with just all the suicides we've had, of teenagers and also of early 20-somethings, and so it could be a great resource for our community.
Not to end on a downer either, but death and loss are inescapable things.
Okay,
And
Trevor.
so for anyone who is currently in a place where they aren't experiencing the heaviness of that, it's important to realize that one day you will, because it's inevitable. And so
Trevor, your existential showing.
It is
so
really showing.
Sorry.
But I am of the belief that it's important to learn and to grow.
I agree.
Especially in seasons when you're feeling strong and capable.
Yeah.
Resourcing.
Like you said, having some information, having some knowledge can be really soothing.
Yeah,
and if we
absolutely.
can do that before a loss, it can give more. It's kind of like having a guide on the path that you're going on.
So, listeners, Trevor is asking you to be proactive.
Yes.
Something
Knowing that death is
this is good.
That we cannot escape our own
Right.
deaths or the deaths of others.
When's your poetry book coming out,
I
Trevor?
don't know.
let's get him graduated first, and then
I just stopped writing poetry in high school because it was making me more depressed.
Yeah, well,
yeah. Well, Jesse, thanks for joining us today. I
yes,
really
thank
appreciate
you
it.
for having me. It was really nice getting to talk to you both.
Thank you for joining Candid Conversations. If you would like more information, you can email candid@mayfieldcounseling.com or call 719-452-4803.